V'asu li mikdash v'shachanti betocham. As the Torah portion opens this morning, God tells Moses to gather together the most precious material. God tells him, "You shall build for me a mikdash, a sacred space, so that I, God, may dwell among them," the Jewish people who built it. Although this Mishkan is built from gold and other beautiful materials, its most remarkable feature is actually its portability and its impermanence. Unlike the later temples in Jerusalem and synagogues across the world today, the Mishkan was not fixed in a specific location. Rather, it moved together with the Jewish people as they traveled from one spot to the next on their journey to the land of Israel. Later, the Mishkan would move from city to city within Israel. And the Torah will describe how the priests and the Levites assemble it and then take it apart and transport it on carts drawn by oxen. Wherever the Jewish people stopped, they set up the Mishkan in the center of the camp so that all the Jewish people would feel the presence of God wherever they were on that particular day. I thought about the Kohanim and the Leviim who set up and transported the Mishkan on the final night of camp last summer. At Camp Ramah, while the campers were saying goodbye to their friends with hugs and with tears, it was the visiting rabbi's job to go around camp, not on oxen, but on golf carts, and to disassemble the temporary sanctuaries that had been set up for each Edah, each age division, all over the camp. Each day of summer, the campers would gather with their counselors for traditional tefillah and for learning. But instead of altars, menorahs, and the other special fixings that we read about in Parshat Truma, we had to gather together hundreds of copies of this, the travel-size edition of Siddur Sim Shalom. And before next summer, another group of staff will schlep the Siddurim to the new locations where new groups of campers will gather to pray to God over the course of the summer. If you grew up in a conservative synagogue, you were probably familiar with the little book's Big Brother, the full-size edition of Siddur Sim Shalom. But I've always thought that the smaller, pocket-sized, travel-size that can fit in a suitcase in a Talis and Tefillin bag edition was special. A copy of this small Siddur was and continues to be given to every camper at all of the Ramah camps and to every participant on USY's summer programs. I got one when I went on the Conservative Movement's Birthright trip in college. On summer programs like USY on Wheels, participants will daven every day, but they rarely stop at synagogues. Instead, they pull out their personalized, often decorated copies of Siddur Sim Shalom and hold services wherever they are, just like the ancient Jews who used the Mishkan wherever they were to bring God's presence into that location. And I want to reflect on the impact of Siddur Sim Shalom this Shabbat because of the passing several days ago of the man who lovingly served as editor for this Siddur, Rabbi Jules Harlow of blessed memory at the age of 92 years old. One of the facets of more traditional Jewish communities that I most admire is the way they venerate the scholars whose experiences, philosophies, and writings animate their communities even after the person has passed away. And I believe that as conservative Jews, we should honor our own distinct scholars who have shaped our approach to Jewish tradition. I only met Rabbi Harlow in passing at JTS, as he was a very different generation than I was. But his life and his work has affected the practice of Judaism for me and for most people who have spent time in conservative synagogues. Jules Harlow was born in Sioux City, Iowa, and in an interview about his childhood, he recalled that every Shabbat he went with his grandfather, his Zayda, to study Gemara, Talmud, with the local Orthodox rabbi. And although he was not an active participant in the study as a child, he paid attention as best he could, and periodically the rabbi would turn to him and ask him questions. When he went off to rabbinical school at JTS, he would write weekly postcards to his Zeta, in which he shared with him what section of the Gemara he was learning that week. When his grandfather passed away, Rabbi Harlow went home for the Shiva and found his grandfather's Gemara open to the page that he had been learning in school, because even from a distance, his grandfather had been learning alongside of him, demonstrating the ability of the words in our sacred books to create a connection, to bring us together in community, even at a distance. After his ordination, Rabbi Harlow began working in the liturgical publications department of the Rabbinical Assembly and assisted with the development of several older projects. But when the Rabbinical Assembly embarked on publishing its most comprehensive Siddur, Rabbi Harlow was selected to serve as the editor. So generations of conservative Jews learned the Siddur, and by extension, the services, in the same way that Rabbi Harlow envisioned them. In contrast to many Siddurim published today, he consciously chose to include very little commentary in the prayer book because he felt that studying a text was different than praying a text, and that when you are praying, you should be focused on the act of prayer. While Siddur Sim Shalom, which was published initially in 1985, was quite traditional in its scope, the new prayer book refined the language and the theology of conservative Judaism in several important ways. His approach towards liturgy epitomized the slogan that conservative Judaism used for much of the 20th century, including commitment to both tradition and change. And describing his work, he wrote, "Our prayer book should be a living document, reflecting the evolving needs and values of our community." But at the same time, in his introduction to the Siddur, he wrote, "It is natural that an editor writing about a new prayer book should emphasize the new features of the volume on which he has labored, and to point out what would be missing in the world of prayer without the new volume. Precisely because changes are emphasized, it is important to maintain a balanced view by realizing that the overwhelming majority of Hebrew texts in new editions preserve and perpetuate texts which have been in existence since the classic age of Jewish prayer composition. We are linked to Jews of centuries past who have used the same liturgical formulations in addressing our Creator, in confronting challenges of faith and the Spirit, and in expressing gratitude and praise. The Jew in prayer does not stand alone before God. The first-person plural form of almost all Jewish prayer reflects the fact that we stand in prayer together with Jews of all places in our time and of all centuries in our distinctive history. We hope that this will bind us with future generations as well. The prayers that we say reflect the theology that we believe, and as such, Rabbi Harlow's Siddur made a number of significant modifications. He included alternative language in many Shabbat prayers that talk about the sacrifices that our ancestors used to worship God in the Mishkan. But instead of longing for a return to the ancient way of religion, he included texts that included loving references to the past, but recognized that we do not seek to go back. But perhaps most notably for late 20th century Jews, Siddur Sim Shalom was the first prayer book to incorporate the creation of the State of Israel as a theological reality and the Holocaust as a moral tragedy. While he could have referenced these events in supplemental English readings, he believed that they were so world-changing that they should be part of the core prayer texts that all communities recite and feel like they are integral to the service. So he turned to the celebratory Al-Hanisim prayer that we recite on Hanukkah and Purim, and composed a new version in the same style that told the story of the founding of the State of Israel. He composed other new prayers to mourn the losses of the Holocaust. In other areas, he struggled. He personally struggled with how to balance the needs of an egalitarian Judaism that valued men and women with texts in the Siddur that only reflected a male experience, but that he felt should not be changed. While later Siddurim, like the one that we use today, include the names of the matriarchs in the Amidah, he felt this was not a change that he could make to the liturgy. In an article called Feminist Linguistics in Jewish Liturgy, he analyzed many suggested egalitarian changes and expertly showed why he agreed with some of them and found others not to be in the spirit of the original prayer. But remarkably, in the same article, in which he did not hold back in disagreeing with something, he wrote, "I do not believe that liturgical language should be used as a litmus test for Jewish piety. If you know how seriously communities and individuals within communities take choices over which prayers to say, which words to choose, and how to say them, you know how remarkable it is for a liturgist, for a scholar of this material, to say that he was not going to judge the piety of someone who makes a different choice than he did." When I heard that Rabbi Harlow had passed away, I went back and reread the introduction he wrote to Siddur Sim Shalom, and was amazed to read a master class in Jewish prayer. Even though his Siddur is not as commonly used in conservative synagogues as it once was, his scholarship and reflections on prayer stand the test of time. But, like many of the details of the design of the Mishkan that we read in the Torah today, these academic liturgical discussions appear dry and incomprehensible to most people, accessible and interesting only to a highly educated elite. So I think that more important than the discussions of details that took place long ago is the finished product and the effect of the finished product. In a few weeks, we will read about Moses and the artisans finishing all of their work on the Mishkan, and the amazement of the Israelites as God's presence fills the Mishkan, and they see that their project has brought their community closer to God. Today, we do not have one central shrine where God's presence dwells. Yes, we have beautiful synagogues, but we have something better. We have the words of the tradition and the books in which they are published. In his commentary on Parshat Truma, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs wrote, "After the destruction of the Second Temple, which succeeded the Mishkan, Jews lived by an ancient and fundamental insight that God does not live in buildings, but in the human heart. The Shekhinah, God's indwelling presence, was in a people, not a place. The traces of God's Spirit are to be found in human lives. What in other faiths was achieved through architecture, visible symbols of the order and majesty of creation, was achieved in Judaism through the life of the holy community, constructed according to the plans of the Torah. The rabbis carved, polished, and engraved its teachings as if they were stones of a great edifice. And so they were, but it was a living one built out of words and deeds. A Jewish legend says that when the temple was destroyed, splinters from its stones entered the hearts of the Jewish people. When they gathered as Knesset Yisrael, the congregation of Israel, united across space and time in the collective service of God, they became a kind of human temple, and in their lives the divine presence found its earthly home. Rabbi Jules Harlow, who passed away this week, was one in a long line of scholars who carved, polished, and engraved the words of Jewish tradition so that it was beautiful and meaningful for the people who used it. Since he published his Siddur in 1985, Jews have used his words to feel the presence of God in their communities, and they have used his Siddur to form those communities, whether they are in grand synagogues like this, a wooden deck with a beautiful view at camp, or on a bus traveling from one city to another. May Rabbi Harlow's memory be for a blessing, and may we continue to use his work and the work of his successors in the command that God gives to Moses, "And you shall build for me, for God, a sacred space, so that God may dwell among all of us." Shabbat Shalom.